I welcome everyone in this breakout room to the academic paper workshop part 2 of the AI conference. We will have 2 young researchers presenting today, as each around like 15 to 25 minutes with a short Q&A in the end, and we'll sum up around like 10 o'clock. And afterwards you can join the rest of the presentations today. And like first to present is Niklas Eder. Niklas is a PhD student at the Humboldt University and the University of Leipzig. I think he was currently visiting fellow at the Information Society project at Yale Law School. But as I understood, you're back in Berlin right now. Niklas,
yeah, but
right?
I'm still at the ISP. It's just that everything is still online.
Yeah. Nobody ever knows these days where people are. But we are very glad to have you, and I think you're gonna present your study of like how personalization affects the balance of power between ordinary people and institutions and the implications for democracy. And with this, I would like give the word to you, and happy to enjoy the presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm really grateful I can present here today. Thanks everyone for joining me this morning. It's always extremely rewarding to have people here get up in the morning early and listen to what I want to share with you. I share some of the insights of a paper that I recently wrote and that I will publish with Stanford Technology Law Review, which is called Beyond Automation, Machine Learning-Based Systems and Human Behavior in the Personalization Economy. I want to begin with sharing 3 observations with you. The first observation is that all spheres of life increasingly resemble the online space. Algorithmically generated knowledge is used to personalize conditions for receiving loans, to decide who to consider for a vacancy, who to consider as tenants, who to support in job-seeking processes, or who to grant bail. All of these examples, I think you've already heard them. My more general observation of what all of this entails is that machine learning algorithms are creating a space in which behavior is permanently tracked, analyzed, and ultimately converted into ubiquitous personalized treatments. What we have seen in the online space, that our behavior is tracked and somewhat echoes back to us later in the future, is now or is increasingly true for all spheres of life. Machine learning-based decision systems sort individuals according to their digital reputations and then set the conditions on the basis of which corporations interact with us. So the way that we are seen, the way that we are perceived, and the way that we are treated in all spheres of life is increasingly personalized in the way that we are treated and tracked in the online space. The second observation that I would like to share with you is that corporate automated systems will profoundly shape our lives. What do I mean by that? I mean that if corporations with who we interact and on whose services we rely, on who rely to hire us, to give us loans, to give us housing, if all of them see us through machine learning-based systems, then this is going to affect significantly the opportunities that we are going to have in life. I think all of you have heard about surveillance capitalism. Surveillance capitalism really is engaging with behavioral profiling online and with problems that can entail for human agency. However, when we look at surveillance capitalism, we mainly think about advertisement. I am not looking at advertisement here. What I am looking at is when corporations personalize the conditions on the basis of which they interact with us. And this is even much more intrusive to our lives than just being showcased certain kinds of advertisements. So I think while the problem that is discussed under the notion of surveillance capitalism is one which is extremely urgent, this problem that we're looking at here that I want to discuss with you is even more urgent because it directly influences how we can lead our lives. The third observation, which I would like to share with you, is that to understand the effects that these systems produce, we have to account for the fact that it is machine learning algorithms which analyze the information and thereby shape the outcomes which these systems produce. Whether we are regarded as being successful in the future and therefore as good partners, good business partners, good employees, depends on the logic of machine learning algorithms. So now when we think about automated systems, it's not only automation which we have to account for, it's also the fact that machine learning algorithms really shape the kind of information which is produced by these systems. Now there's a few questions which I would like to reflect on together with you today. The most general one is, what are the effects of machine learning-based personalization on the individual and on society? That is what my paper is about. To answer that question, I would ask two more questions. The first is, how does the personalization economy affect human behavior? And then, how does it affect human freedom? To reflect on these questions, I would like to look at an example with you, the example of marriage counseling. Going to marriage counseling puts a couple into a particular group, a group which correlates with the outcome of financial distress. Couples who go to marriage counseling have a higher than usual rate of getting divorced, and individuals who are divorced are more likely than others to suffer financial hardship. Thus, a credit card company which uses an algorithmic system that discovers this correlation automatically increases the interest rates of that couple and thus further contributes to the risk of financial hardship. What I think this example shows is that an environment of ubiquitous data collection and machine learning-based decision-making, in such an environment, everything that a person does produces echoes in the form of machine learning-based decisions. Every movement, every habit, every hobby, every friendship, every purchase has consequences which are defined by the correlative logic of machine learning algorithms. Machine learning-based systems sanction individuals for behavior which correlates with unfavorable outcomes and rewards them for behavior which correlates with success. Put more generally, machine learning-based decision-making establishes a system which evaluates the social interactions of individuals, and I think is thus likely to influence how individuals interact. In legal academia, there are few scholars which have started to think about these issues. Frank Piscali, who gave the example, writes that this is effectively a marriage counseling penalty. Once disclosed that the credit rates are increased because of going to marriage counseling, this could discourage a couple from seeking the counseling they need to save their relationship. So he has here a first intuition of how the system of machine learning-based decision-making, which affected the couple in that situation, might affect their behavior. Jack Balkin from the ISP at Yale talks about this under the notion of normalization or regimentation. He refers to this as a dynamic in which an algorithm causes you to internalize its classification and assessments of risks, causing you to alter your behavior in order to avoid surveillance or being categorized as risky. Viktor Meyer-Schönberger writes that subsequent generations may have a big data consciousness, the presumption that there is a quantitative component to all that we do. I find these observations from these scholars, I found them very fascinating, but at the same time, what I think was lacking was a conceptual background to describe how such a consciousness, a big data consciousness, would develop. And then I was wondering, is there any theoretical starting point to substantiate reflections like this? We're not in the empirical track here, we're in the doctrinal track. I did not build on data to kind of prove that there might be certain effects on human behavior, but I'm building on theory. And I think that's adequate also because I am engaging here with a development which is just beginning to take shape, but which is over the next decades going to become more pronounced. And so in my paper, I develop a number of different theoretical starting points to look at this dynamic, and I build on surveillance theory. I build on two different strands of surveillance theory. One of them is the surveillance assemblage, which I'm not going to discuss today. And the other one is panopticism. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to build on panopticism to describe what effects machine learning-based decision-making potentially might have on the behavior and on freedom of individuals. The starting point for Foucault's concept of panopticism has been in architectural design by Bentham, the panopticon. Bentham designed a prison in the shape of an octangle with a guard tower in its center. The central tower allowed a clear view into the cells of the inmates at all times. With the rules of the prisons clearly laid out to the inmates, and the inmates within the gaze of the guards, the inmates had to comply with the rules of the prison or otherwise fear sanctions. The panoptic prison, with inmates knowing that they could be observed at any time, created an incentive for them to self-police their behavior permanently and to comply with the rules of the prison at all times. What Bentham's prison did was that it converted physical power over the body of inmates into more discrete and effective power over their minds and agency. Building on that architectural design, Foucault developed panopticism as an analytical model with which he described a form of exercising power through surveillance, a way of governing people in what he described as disciplinary societies. In disciplinary societies, the goal of governance was not only to maintain physical control and define the outer limits of acceptable behavior, but to shape the way people lead their lives on a granular basis, to train their minds and souls. Individuals were incentivized to self-police their lives, to comply with the rules to which they are submitted at all times. The concept of panopticism, to sum that up, offers a detailed account of a certain way of functioning of power. It describes a dynamic in which rules, which are established by an authority which has the power to surveil and sanction, translate into the agency of individuals who internalize these rules. And now I'm developing a panoptic perspective on machine learning-based decision-making. Now we have a bit of an understanding what panopticism is, and now we can use the concept to look at machine learning-based decision-making, reflect on how that transforms the environment in which we live, and whether we might see some of the same dynamics and power relations emerging from this new technology. The first question then is, are there any sanctions in the system of machine learning-based decision-making? Obviously, it's not a conventional state-citizen relation where one is clearly subordinated to the other. It's about people interacting with corporations. However, I think there's little doubt that decisions taken by corporate algorithmic systems can have either favorable or detrimental effects on individuals. And as such, from the point of view of the individual, are experienced as reward or sanctions. So I think that condition of a panoptic setting is already fulfilled. Hard questions, when considering machine learning-based decision-making as a panoptic setting, regard the existence of a coherent set of rules underlying these sanctions and the comprehensibility of these rules for these individuals. Because first, if we would expect individuals to modify their behavior in reaction to machine learning-based decision-making to comply with certain rules that they established, we have to find out, is there really something like a set of coherent rules that machine learning-based decision-making creates and ultimately enforces? And second, we have to wonder, would people understand these rules? Because I guess understanding these rules is a precondition for modifying your behavior in reaction to them. So is there a coherent set of rules which underlies machine learning-based decision-making, which kind of governs whether it produces favorable or detrimental outcomes for particular persons in a particular situation? The first and obvious answer is no. All of these systems are used by a variety of different players. And so we could expect that they would also produce a variety of different results. However, I think the reason why machine learning algorithms are likely to produce a coherent set of rules is because they reduce human involvement in decision processes and replace it with algorithmic assessments. Doing that, they also diminish the particularities of these processes. All processes are increasingly shaped by inferences produced by machine learning algorithms and are based on the correlations that these algorithms have detected. If we think that machine learning-based systems produce relatively similar results in a variety of different situations, then the final question is, do individuals at all comprehend these kind of new rules which are created or not? Because if they don't, how would they modify their behavior? I think that individuals will develop such an understanding. I think technical expertise is not necessary to adapt one's behavior to the rewarding and sanctioning regime of machine learning-based decision-making. One can also learn to play by these rules simply based on intuition. I think Daniel Kahneman has proven that human intuition is one of the most important drivers of human decision-making and agency. And this is also true in this situation. If you simply have this vague feeling that whatever you do produces results in the future, you might change your behavior already based on that feeling. Imagine when you surf through the internet, for example, and you think that your behavior is tracked, you might modify the way you operate in the internet. So I think there's a fairly good chance that in the future, we will feel the way that we feel in the online space in everyday life, even offline. While these effects might still be negligible at the moment, they might play a much greater role in the future. So if all of that is the case, I think the important question for us is, what are adequate legal responses to all of this? if we acknowledge that machine learning-based decision-making is going to transform our environment and ultimately shape our behavior, how should we respond to it from a legal perspective? The first starting point that we often hear as a response to machine learning-based decision-making is explainability and transparency. I claim that explainability and transparency in the dynamics that I am looking at, that I have described, do not solve the problem, but just make it much worse. Explainability and transparency contribute to a better understanding for the individuals of the rules on the basis of which they are judged, and thus enable them to internalize these rules more easily. The internalization of rules, however, is not a sign of emancipation, but of submission to foreign standards. As the context in which panopticism has originally been developed, the prison illustrates, establishing rules over people and subsequently surveilling them is a tool of suppression. So I think while there's many reasons why explainability and transparency are something that we should desire, there are also reasons why we should believe that they do not solve all the problems that these systems create. The second claim that I would like to make with regard to adequate legal responses is that we should not rely on individual rights to respond to this development. The idea that just informing the individual and entitling the individual with rights confronts larger objections regarding the neoliberal construction of the individual as an optimizing rational actor. Formal rights and the theoretical possibility of taking advantage of these rights are often equated with guaranteeing protection, although they have little or no practical effect on the situation of those who they are supposed to empower. Rights put the burden of responding to illicit transformations of our environment on the individual. Thereby, they justify the existence of these practices as individuals theoretically had the possibility to object to them. The information and rights-based approach builds on an individualistic and atomistic understanding of the surveillance practices I have described, and this understanding is misplaced. We have to look at the greater collective consequences of machine learning-based decision-making and not only look at the particular individual relations between an individual and a corporation. If we look at singular snowflakes, we do not understand the impact of a snowstorm. It's only once snowflakes transform into a crater hole, into a thick layer of snow, that they have a significant effect. Machine learning-based decision-making has similar effects, which only become visible when looking at it as a whole, when we understand that they do not only change the individual relationships between a person and a company, but more generally, the environment through which an individual maneuvers, in which he or she lives, and in which this individual tries to pursue his or her opportunities and dreams. So ultimately, to wrap up, what my analysis, I hope, shows is that machine learning-based decision-making can establish a mode of governance, can be regarded as a mode of governance. And thereby, we have to develop concepts to respond to the new power dynamics which are created in this mode of governance. And I'm suggesting the notion of legitimacy to respond to that. The notion of legitimacy helps us to ask questions like who governs and who is governed, What are the rules which are enforced by the governance, and what notions can we rely on to change a system of governance? What institutions can we rely on? So I think we have to develop new concepts on the basis of that notion. The paper that I have recently written and is going to be published, I think, in December is one attempt to do that. And I would be extremely happy if I made you just a little bit curious on what I think where we should take this. Thanks a lot for your attention, and that's it from my side.
Cool. Thank you very much, Niklas, for presenting this highly interesting concept of panopticism and applied it to the new AI world. Now we would have like some minutes open for questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to directly speak, or you can also put it in the comment section of the chat and I will read it for you if you're at the moment not able to use the mic.
If you don't mind waiting for the questions, I would have a questions because I find your paper fantastically interesting. First, congratulations on that. And I think this is the most interesting session, frankly enough, because we already know what policymakers think and what they will say during the whole conference, but you are the next generation and your thoughts are very thought-provoking. So my question is very simple, actually. Why is there the keywords democracy and the rule of law are not part of your paper? Because I think it would be key to the legitimacy issue and response that you're searching for. So is it that you have in mind and you will be developing other concepts than that? That would be my question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the question, Karin. That's a really good question. And in fact, in my paper, I do talk about how all of this affects liberal democratic values. So I do rely on that notion of liberal democracy, and I try to look at some of the values and principles which are essential to liberal democracies, and then I focus on freedom. But I think I don't directly rely on the idea of the rule of law, because I'm also trying to challenge a little bit this more general idea that what we have to do to respond to the influence that data analysis practices have on our lives, we can respond to that simply by entitling individuals to certain rights, and then on the basis basically of the rule of law, they can enforce these rights. And just by distributing rights in the correct way in a liberal democracy, we solve all of these dynamics which new technologies cause. I think when looking at the general data protection regulation, it has been a big mistake to mainly rely on rights and information to, for example, legitimize data collection practices online, like this whole inform and consent, this whole cookies policies thing. I simply think it's not working because in the end, it's the individual who has to invest time and resources if he or she wanted to really find out what happens to his or her data. And I think it shouldn't be the individual. I think what the job is of politics in this regard is to design the system in a way that it's simply not as harmful to individuals as it is right now, even if individuals don't have the resources, the knowledge, and the personal power to kind of fight for their rights. But ultimately, I think you're absolutely right that the context of how do we want to design this to comply with our views, with our values in a liberal democracy, that's absolutely essential. And that's also something which I elaborate a bit more in my paper.
So just one word, I think that maybe what you could do as well as a follow-up, this is just my opinion, is since it is the rule of law and not the rule of rights, and all those and the rule of law condition rights, that's for sure, it's also condition our governance system. And if you consider the rule of law as the basis of our governance system, then maybe you could reframe the concept of the rule of law so that it would fit to counterbalance decision making by automated system and so on, machine learning.
Yeah.
Just a thought. That's it.
Thanks so much, Karin. That's a great idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Niklas. And yeah, right now, in the interest of time, I think I would like to move forward to the next presenter. But I'm sure if you have any more questions in regard to Niklas' presentation, he will be happy to answer them in the chat, or maybe we will even have time in the end of the two presentation to discuss a little bit further. But thank you very much for the highly interesting presentation. And with this, I'm more than happy to welcome Natalia. She's a PhD student at the European University Institute in Florence, if I'm right. I hope the weather is a little bit better in Italy than it is in Zurich. And she's presenting her study of the relevance of the GDPR, the LED, the Law Enforcement Directive, and the new proposed AI regulations for the problem of bias in facial recognition. And like now, with no further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca, for the introduction and also for giving me the opportunity to be here presenting with you. The weather is, from my point of view, much better in Florence, maybe too much better. So yeah, the title of my paper is In Search of a European Legal Framework to Tackle the Bias Problem of Facial Recognition Technology. And what I'm going to try to do during these minutes, also taking into consideration time constraints, is to dissect this problem, when I'm talking about the bias problem, what I'm referring to, also the consequences of this problem. I'm going trying to explain why is it difficult to tackle this problem in European law. I'm going to try to very briefly analyze the three regulatory instruments that I consider the most relevant when we discuss this problem, especially for facial recognition technology, and then to draw on some very initial and brief conclusions. For the problem, I referred in my title to the bias problem. What am I talking about? I'm not going to bother you because I'm sure you are all familiar with algorithmic bias in general and also referring to facial recognition. But just a quick introduction, modern facial recognition is empowered by artificial intelligence. So this means that the facial recognition systems are trained using a training database composed by facial images. As you can see in this first piece of news, for example, when these training databases are composed by facial images only of white males, only males, there is going to be accuracy issues when identifying, for example, women or Black women. Probably you are all familiar with the work at this respect by, for example, Joy Bulamwini and also Timmy Gebru, an issue that has already been analyzed by the academia. And for example, I can recommend this explainer or this primer on understanding bias in facial recognition by the Alan Turing Institute. But probably the mainstream tackle for this issue is based on race or gender, but also let's think about people with craniofacial differences. People suffering from the George syndrome have to go through craniofacial surgery several times during their lifetime. And if we take into account that training data sets are not, there is no presence of facial images of people through craniofacial surgery or things like that, there are going to be accuracy issues also in facial recognition systems trying to identify these people. So this is not only an issue based on race or in gender, there is a much wider spread of algorithmic bias for facial recognition systems. And what are the consequences of this issue? As you also probably are aware of, there have been several cases, especially in the United States, where people, especially Black men, were wrongfully arrested. They even were held for several hours because of wrong identifying by facial recognition technology. But also there were other cases. As I mentioned, the spectrum is wider. There were cases of transgender men identified as women by this system, and also vice versa, transgender women identify as men by facial recognition technology. So as I have pointed out, this is a worth mentioning issue that needs further explanation. Also, if we take in account that one of the main players using or aiming at using facial recognition technology are law enforcement agencies, as also we will see later on in the presentation. So difficult to tackle this problem in European law, in the EU regime. Well, first, because there's no specific regulation for facial recognition technology, we have, as I mentioned, the GDPR or the Law Enforcement Directive. We have the proposal, at this moment it's only a proposal of an AI Act. But for example, in the case of the GDPR and the Law Enforcement Directive, these are technologically neutral regulations, so this can be an advantage, but they focus only on data-driven technology. So there are some wide baked aspects that, in the case of facial recognition, leave a vacuum that could be a perfect, let's say, a perfect pond for algorithmic bias to develop and to grow. There is also a big fragmented picture as far as geographical scope of the law is concerned. I will draw on this more during the presentation, but there is also a lack of case law. I have named here the only pieces of case law that we have at the respect at the moment. One is also set in South Wales. So we cannot say from the European law point of view now with the Brexit, and the other one happened in France, and we will develop more on these cases, but there is a fragmented picture from the geographically point of view. And also the dispositions that we have, talking about or tackling algorithmic bias, are not sufficiently operationalized up to this point, and I will draw on later on this point. So now if we move to the specific regulatory instruments that we have to tackle this issue, the first one is the GDPR. Why did I choose the GDPR? There could be other instruments, for example, human rights instrument, but I decided to focus on the GDPR because facial images, as I explained on my first slide, are the food for facial recognition technologies, the thing used to train these systems. These facial images are biometric, thus sensitive personal data. The GDPR mentions facial images as biometric data. Biometric data are considered sensitive data and thus personal data when these facial images are used to identify and individualize one person, of course. And the source also for this algorithmic facial image. The GDPR allows the member states to provide additional and specific rules regarding the processing of this biometric data. But this, as I mentioned in my previous slides, only helps to create a fragmented regulatory picture. So there are, for example, in Sweden, in the border management context, there are specific laws regarding the processing of biometric data, but other countries, other European countries do not have these laws at all. Some others have specific laws of biometric data processing, but for different purposes. So this creates an irregular and not harmonized regime through all the European Union. If we move to the lawful grounds for data processing, specifically in the case of facial recognition technology, the processing of biometric data is in principle prohibited, so the use of facial recognition would be prohibited. However, there are some exceptions in paragraph 2 of this Article 9. I'm going to tackle not all of them, some of these exceptions that I consider more relevant for the purpose of this presentation. The first one being consent. And as you probably know, the GDPR establishes that one of the conditions for consent is that it has to be informed. So as I mentioned here in this slide, taking into account the black box nature of artificial intelligence system, it would be very difficult for a person consenting to the use of facial recognition to really understand what he or she is consenting to. How do these systems work? How were they trained? What are the consequences of consenting to these systems, etc. Also, facial recognition technology can be employed on top of other technologies, for example, CCTV or thermal scanners. So simultaneous function at the same time. Again, this could be difficult to explain when trying to draw consent from somebody. There is also a problem of power dynamics. For example, in a school, this is one of the cases I mentioned in my previous slide, the French case. Facial recognition technology was installed in a school to check attendance of the students. In principle, the students have consented to this use of facial recognition, but in reality, the court determined that there was a power dynamic where the personnel of the school had power to decide over the future and the current academic, let's say, life of the student. So there was not a horizontal relationship, and therefore consent was not lawfully obtained. Remedies for this consent problematics I have explained. We have Articles 12 or 15 of the GDPR, right to information, access, also the possibility to withdraw consent on Article 7. And I would also like to throw to the further debate maybe the possibility to issue a compliance standard on consent in the line of, for example, ISO certification or something like that. This could give the industry some certainty, and also if it would be carefully designed, could give guarantees to the rights of the people affected. Moving on, other lawful grounds for data processing, we have processing related to personal data, which are manifestly made public by the data subject. This could be also the case of pictures willingly shared on social network services public profile. Probably you also all are the case of Clearview AI. Clearview AI is an American company whose main clients are law enforcement agencies, and they provide facial recognition technology services. While they claim that one of the main attractives of this company is precisely the big data facial images database that they provide. They claim that this database is mainly built on public pictures taken from public places from the internet. However, there has been a wide criticism against how they obtain and the real origin of these pictures. For example, there is a recent decision by the Swedish Data Protection Authority that fined the Swedish police for using Clearview AI services. And also Facebook facial recognition tool is the tag suggestions tool. It's empowered by facial recognition technology. Initially, you have to consent to it on the settings tool of your Facebook account. But there are a series of, I'm not going to go deeper into this question, but there are a series of steps you have to go through. There are also, it has been discussed whether there's a dark patterns case in this specific issue, so it's not straightforward. In letter G, we have substantial public interest, and I will go further in this when I talk about law enforcement, but basically this is not defined by the GDPR, so it's very difficult to decide when we are talking about a substantial public interest, or maybe if less intrusive measures could have been employed. In letter I, we have reasons of public interest, but in this case, in the area of public health or protecting against serious cross-border threats. This could be the case of the COVID-19. It has been also discussed by the literature whether the deployment of facial recognition technology in the context of the pandemic, for example, to track compliance with quarantine or with the use of face masks, it has been proportionate and necessary, also using this lawful ground for data processing. If we move to the principles relating to the processing of personal data, Article 5, paragraph 1 in letter A talks about lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And here we arrive to the bias issue. The European Data Protection Board operationalized the principle of fairness into non-discrimination as a prohibition to unfairly discriminate against data subjects. This could be the case of accuracy issues by facial recognition and the consequences of these issues. Non-exploitation as a prohibition to take advantage of the needs or vulnerabilities of the data subjects. Also human intervention, okay, so humans in the loop, something we will also be talking about in this presentation to manage or to review in the search of biases. And this could be also a mechanism for algorithmic accountability. And also fair algorithms and regular assessment of whether these algorithms were following their objectives and adjust to reduce biases, bias loops, and maintain fairness in processing. So we have these principles that are very close to the problematic that I have mentioned, but we still need to tackle how this is going to be in reality. In D, we have accuracy that basically I have explained in my previous slide, so I'm not going to go further, but basically when there's accuracy issues and these issues finish or conclude in discriminatory effects on natural person. For example, if we remember the wrongfully accused person. So as I mentioned, we have these principles, but how do we operationalize, how to bring them into reality? So we have, as I mentioned, the right to information as a right for the data subject to enforce their rights. And we also have data protection impact assessments, which are on Article 35, are precisely thought for data processing, in particular using new technologies. This is the case, entailing a high risk to the rights and rights of natural persons. So as I have explained, this is also the case. We have the obligation in Article 36(1) when there is a high risk to preventively ask the data protection authority. And also in the Article 58.2(f), the possibility of the DPA temporarily or permanently banning the use of the technological issue. There was, for example, a case in May 2019, the Danish DPA allowed a football club to use facial recognition to classify spectators who were forbidden for entering into one stadium. So in this case, the public interest rationale that I mentioned before was the or to use facial recognition, but also some characteristics that the system had to meet. For example, that data not corresponding to a prohibited person should not be stored, clear notices should be shown, the personal data should be encrypted, and also regarding the access to the internet of facial recognition technologies. Also in the South Wales case that I mentioned, the court was satisfied that the Data Protection Authority include a straightforward account describing the processing proposed. And in general, data protection impact assessment building on these two cases should contain the following elements. So regarding transparency, explicit notifications. For example, the UK Data Protection Authority has proposed a three-tier strategy using social media, displaying signs on police cars, and issuing leaflets to citizens. Also taking into account proportionality, the principles of necessity and proportionality, we are going to discuss them later, but are very important. If a goal can be reached using less invasive methodologies, facial recognition should not be used. There were also issues of data minimization and defense, because cybersecurity of these systems is very important. All data breaches are important, but for example, if we think passwords or bank accounts or credit cards can be changed, can be modified, can be replaced, but faces cannot. So once your facial template is in power of, for example, the law enforcement system or Clearview AI's database, you can ask for 2 years, but you cannot change your face or your template. If we move to the law enforcement directive, as I mentioned, law enforcement agencies are one of the biggest players using this technology. You can see here some examples. And also, I highly recommend this report by the Fundamental Rights Agency, especially on the use of facial recognition in the of law enforcement. So, facial recognition technology for law enforcement entails advantages. It helps identifying suspects in a way that manual or human couldn't do, and also it could help find missing people. There has been a recent case in India where children could be found thanks to the use of facial recognition technology. However, the fundamental rights at stake in this case are even higher than in the other cases, and also, as I mentioned before, as an example, there could have been some arrest because of these issues. Very briefly, because the content of the directive is very similar to the GDPR. It also contains the principles of proportionality and necessity, and also a couple of differences, Article 7 and Article 8. Article 7 makes a difference between personal data based on facts and personal data based on personal assessment. So this basically obliges member states and authorities to verify the quality of personal data in or making them available. And in this case, I think this is important because the quality of personal data has been tackled as one of the things or one of the sources for algorithmic bias. And regarding Article 8, again, we have here the principles of necessity and proportionality. We could argue, is it necessary or would it be proportionate to identify a suspect, to identify a terrorist, to deploy live facial recognition all over a city or all over a country? This is a question that has not been answered up to this moment, but I think it's at the core of the debate. Again, the law enforcement directive provides the same remedies as the GDPR, access and rectification, but these remedies could be restricted, for example, in order to protect public security or general interest. So again, if we don't have a uniform interpretation of this term, it could be very difficult to assess these articles. And quickly, I'm going to move to the AI Act. This is a very new piece of, it's a proposal, but piece of regulation, and probably you are all very familiar with it because the moment it was launched, there was a great deal of debates and conferences analyzing. So I'm going to be very brief with this. The AI Act focuses on the uses of the technology, in this case, not on whether it is data-driven or not, but on the uses of the technology, precisely establishing a risk-based approach. So probably you are with this pyramid of the high-risk uses, low-risk uses, etc. It introduces a set of definitions that are important for facial recognition technology, not only biometric systems, but also emotion recognition systems, because even though this is highly debatable, there have been some attempts to work on facial recognition technology who is able to, for example, detect depression or any other mental states, and also other notions such as law enforcement terms. So the most important at this respect is Article 5.1d that bans the use of live facial recognition, okay, but it establishes, as you probably know, a series of exceptions where this could be used. I'm not going to extend very much, but I would like to repeat my question. Where do we draw the line between the use of live facial recognition and, for example, identifying a suspect or using it for law enforcement purposes? And at this respect, also, I would think that the literature has pointed the prohibition in this article does not include real-time use of facial recognition in public authorities for reasons apart from law enforcement. So this is and also this might be intended as a lex specialist in terms of the processing rules. The dispositions that concern us regarding bias are in Article 10. It says that the data set invalidation and test should be subject to data governance and management, in particular in light of biases. But again, we don't know how is this going to be operationalized. We have to wait until the law is approved. But in general, from what we have now, we don't know how this is operationalized apart from data protection impact assessment. And also, Article 10, paragraph 5 allows the processing of sensitive data to the extent really necessary for ensuring bias monitoring and detection and correction. But from my point of view, this could entail a justification for the massive processing of facial images. So we have to think about overfitting systems or data hoarding by using this article or this provision. To take advantage of it, to use it as an excuse to collect more data. Also, in Article record keeping, they talk about in paragraph B. Sorry, this is my time.
Natalia, so I want to wrap up before people will leave for the main session. Yep, I'm sure they're going to stick around for a couple of minutes. So
okay, yeah, very briefly. Also, paragraph B talks about the input data on checking the possible of algorithmic bias, and we're talking about high system. We also have the possibility of bias managing. Also, in the third bulletin, you can see potentially bias outputs utilized as operation feedback loops are very important in the case of algorithmic bias. So very briefly, well, I will draw on my conclusions. The predominant legal framework would be the GDPR, the Law Enforcement Directive, and in this case, the proposal of the directive. But regarding the bias problem, although we have some provisions, there is a lack of operationalization because of a lack of case law and also because of a lack of more examples and more analysis in the use of these technologies. In this case, as I mentioned here, for example, in law enforcement cases, there has been a first deploy, then ask limbo concerning facial recognition. And what I would like to propose is to operationalize the existing legal dispositions on fairness and bias to establish a unitary concept of fairness. For example, what does fairness mean? Means, for example, in the case of facial images, 50% men, 50% women, 50% Black people, 50% white people, 50% false positive, 50% write positives. This is not the case. There is more study needed and more work needed. We will see it in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Natalia.